Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about the New York Times. I've generally found that the best way to discredit New York Times news articles is with older New York Times articles. George Orwell said, "Early in life I have noticed that no event is ever correctly reported in a newspaper." That's particularly true now with the New York Times, although occasionally in the past they actually did accurate reporting. The news out of California is bad. We've screwed up the climate so badly that thousand-year-old trees are burning to the ground. Big Basin Redwood State Park, California's oldest state park, has been greatly devastated by recent wildfires. The park is home to some ancient redwood trees, some well over 1,000 years old. Wow, I used to go to Big Basin Redwood State Park all the time when I lived in California 20 years ago. And here's the New York Times article. It's hard to see your memories burn. Loss from wildfires grows in California. Some of the ancient towering conifers in Big Basin Redwood State Park are a casualty of the fires that have racked the state. Wow, look at that. The fire is burning the inside of the tree right out. And here's a similar picture from the San Jose Mercury News. Fire burning right inside of a redwood tree. That tree's probably going to die for sure, isn't it? But wait a minute, hollowed out redwood trees are one of the main attractions of Big Basin Redwood State Park. In fact, there's places in California where you used to be able to drive a car right through a hollowed out redwood tree. Now let's check with the U.S. Forest Service and find out how redwood trees get hollowed out. Wow, look at that, the redwood trees get hollowed out by fire. Hundreds and hundreds of fires over thousands of years. This is the U.S. Forest Service Coast Redwood Ecology and Management page. Fire cavities, indicators of past fire regimes in coast redwood. Basal cavities are ubiquitous in coast redwood. Known locally as goose pens, these basal hollows can be large enough to hold livestock, as they did for early Euro-American settlers. For centuries, large cavities also provided the occasional shelter for Native Americans. Because they become so large, basal cavities fascinate us, as they add to the uniqueness of the coast redwood forest type. How do these unusual features form? Are they a threat to the health and viability of coast redwood trees? As shown at right, the key reason why these cavities exist is fire. While coast redwood likely evolved with fire, their ability to survive fires is decidedly mixed. Look how high those flames are burning relative to the size of this man. Those flames are at least 20 feet tall. So in other words, what went on in Big Basin this week isn't something unusual, it's something which has been happening for thousands and millions of years. Now let's continue with the New York Times article. The remains of the park headquarters, which was built in 1936 from stone and redwood logs, burned to the ground. Well, that's gotta be climate change. That building's been there since 1936. Now let's check the newspaper archives from 1936, the year the park headquarters was built. Big Basin State Park is located in the Santa Cruz Mountains, which are between the San Francisco Bay and the Pacific Ocean. Santa Cruz News, Saturday, December 5, 1936. Forest fires occurrent in Santa Cruz Mountains for a century, seen as greatest peril to future prosperity. Data compiled by State Forestry Department show county visited by flames almost yearly since Big Fire of 1868, which ran over forested summits from watershed of the Pescadero to peaks of the Gavilons. Wow, that 1868 fire was huge. It burned 30 miles of the mountains. I almost bought a house once at the base of the Gavilons. So apparently there's nothing new about these fires. They burned almost every year from 1868 to 1936. Now let's look at the New York Times from October 9, 1938. Forest fires, one every 3 minutes in 1937, burned almost 22 million acres of the United States. To put that in perspective, there's only been about 3 million acres burned in the United States so far this year, which is less than 1/7 of what burned in 1937. And in the current year's numbers, they include Alaska, which they didn't count in 1938. So there was a lot more burn acreage back then than there is now. Here's a graph from the United States Forest Service, whom I used to work for, showing burn acreage in the United States going back 100 years. There was a lot more burn acreage back in the 1930s than there is now. In fact, ever since about 1960, there's been a lot less burn acreage in the United States. Now let's compare the forest fire burn acreage graph to heat wave graphs from the National Climate Assessment. Prior to 1960, the United States had a lot more burn acreage. And also prior to 1960, we had much worse heat waves. This is not a coincidence. The United States used to be a lot hotter and drier, thus we had more forest fires. This is not rocket science, and you would think our leading scientists and journalists could figure it out. Here's another article from the New York Times from 1992, History of Ancient Fires. Fires also leave revealing scars in the tree tissue, and if enough trees in a wide enough region prove to bear fire scars at the same time, researchers can guess the year was extremely dry. Thomas W. Swetnam and co-workers have discovered that major conflagrations sweeping across many mountain ranges in California and the Southwest were long a common feature, occurring at least twice a decade and apparently linked to oceanic currents much further south, the so-called La Nina events that often result in droughts. Finding this synchronicity in fire events was a big surprise to us, he said. It tells me that western landscapes in pre-settlement era were very smoky places. Well, that article pretty much destroyed the entire current New York Times premise. And here's another one from 1994. Severe ancient droughts, a warning to California. Beginning about 1100 years ago, what is now California baked in two droughts, the first lasting 220 years and the second lasting 140 years. Each was more intense than the mere 6-year dry spells that afflict modern California from time to time. Wow, a 220-year drought 1100 years ago? Those Native Americans must have been driving some huge sport utility vehicles. And here's a graph of those droughts from the San Jose Mercury News. Drought is shown in red. Look at these gigantic droughts they used to have in California, and now they hardly ever have them. These ones were all natural apparently, but this little one here was caused by humans. Isn't government-funded climate science grand? I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico on the edge of the Santa Fe National Forest, and I used to be a wilderness ranger in that forest on the other side of the Rio Grande Valley. Los Alamos has had 3 massive forest fires during my life. One was in 1977, another was in the year 2000, and a third was in the year 2011. These fires were Smokey the Bear's fault. Because of decades of fire suppression, huge amounts of fuel load built up on the ground, so when the fires did burn, they burned all the way up to the tops of the trees. This is what the fires look like from Los Alamos National Laboratory, home of the most educated population in the world. 5,000 PhDs in a town of 20,000 people. It was pretty bad. It burned up almost all of the forest just west of the city. Many people in Los Alamos were sure it was the end of the world. And this is what the burn area looked like last summer, full of greenery and new aspen growth everywhere. Fire is an essential part of the pine forest cycle. Forests can't be healthy without fire. And it's unfortunate that so many PhDs and other scientists don't understand this. Here's another picture I took last summer just west of Los Alamos. There's the burned trees, and you can see all the greenery coming up underneath it. It looks much better now than it did before the fire. And this is Los Alamos Canyon immediately west of the town site. The burned area is filling up with maple trees and locust trees. It's incredibly beautiful there now. I was planning on going back there this summer, but Governor Wuhan Luhan has the place locked down because she's not only worried about carbon dioxide, she's also worried about a virus. As I mentioned before, I used to be a wilderness ranger in the forest right across the Rio Grande Valley from Los Alamos. In 1890, they had massive forest fires there. The forest fires, they're sweeping the Colorado mountains, thousands of acres laid waste. No effort is being made to stay the progress of the devastating cyclone of fire. Denver, Colorado, June 25th. From telegraphic reports received here today, it would seem a great portion of the Sangre de Cristo Range in Colorado and New Mexico is in flames. It burned for dozens of miles up and down the mountain range. Look at that, a devastating cyclone of fire in 1890. They must have been driving some massive SUVs in 1890 to create a cyclone of fire. And just last week, meteorologist Ryan Maui blamed fire-induced tornadoes on a climate crisis. They must have been having a climate crisis in 1890 because they had exactly the same thing. Now let's take a look at what the burn area looks like 130 years later. The burn area located near the Santa Fe ski basin now comprises one of the largest and most spectacular aspen groves anywhere in the world. In fact, the tallest aspen trees in the world grow right here. All of this spectacular scenery was made possible by that giant 1890 cyclone of fire. This is what a Ryan Maui New York Times climate crisis looks like. It's unfortunate that New York Times writers don't actually read the New York Times. They might learn something about science if they did. Toto thinks they're barking up the wrong tree with this forest fire story. You can visit them on the web at realclimatescience.com.